doing some things related to the HIV case study screening, some of the things that people had asked, maybe some things about the next case study, and any questions about mammography in session 8. So are there anything that people would like to talk about or to bring up now? Any burning questions? And can we see, I don't know, I see 3 call-in users. I see Ashley, Barbara, Bridget, Craig, Heather, John, Catherine, and me. And there are 3 call-in users. Can you tell us who you are, if you can?
Hey, this is Eunice.
Say again?
Hi, it's Nancy Brundage.
Hi, Nancy. Welcome from Kansas City.
Hi. Thank you.
Yeah.
Eunice Mafundikwa.
Ah, welcome, Eunice.
Thank you.
Uh-huh. And one more.
Yeah, this is Barbara. I'm on the computer also, but my audio is not working there, so I'm on phone and viewing the screen.
Great. Okay. Well, that's very talented of you, really. Get all the things going. Great. Okay. So are there any particular things folks would like to cover? Otherwise, we'll proceed. We've made a few special treats for you. Okay, well, I'll take that as a no. We'll proceed. At any point, you can chat. We're both here by the computer. Jen's not feeling real well and may, in fact, give herself a rest. And just feel free to chat at any point. There's 2 of us here. You want to go ahead?
Sure. We had several questions from folks concerning the screening, the HIV screening case study last week, and just wanted to go over 2 or 3 things that we thought would be of interest to everyone. The first one, just a second, let me get to the next slide here. The first one is has to do with the questions that related to predictive value positive and negative and their relationships to prevalence. And I don't know, we don't know exactly what you went over in your introductory epidemiology course and whether you covered screening related materials in that course. But there were sometimes people are aware of or not aware of, first of all, predictive value positive itself as an entity to as a measure of a screening program and how well it identifies folks who actually have the disease. But one question that we asked in the case study related to the relationships between predictive value positive and negative and prevalence of disease in the population. And this graph simply shows that relationship for a fixed sensitivity and specificity. It turns out that there is a relationship also between these things and sensitivity and specificity, but if you hold sensitivity and specificity fixed, and in this particular case, we're having them both set at 95%, then the predictive value positive, which is the red line here, is very low, at a very low prevalence of disease in a population that's being screened. And as the prevalence of disease increases within the population, so does the predictive value of positive test. So it goes up, and you can see that as you proceed to the right-hand side here. In contrast, the predictive value of a negative test has essentially the opposite relationship with prevalence, so that at a very low prevalence, the predictive value of a negative test is almost essentially 100%. But as the prevalence increases, the predictive value of a negative test decreases to essentially 0 at 100% prevalence. So just wanted to show people this. There was some uncertainty about this relationship, but this is it. I believe in the part of the case study, once you had completed, I don't know if it was part 1 or if it was part 3, but you, when you got the answers, there was actually a graph, I think, that shows this relationship too. I actually don't know for sure if you were able to see that and see this relationship in that graphic.
Yeah, sometimes we can't see what you see.
Yeah.
We have a sort of opaque view, and so we have to rely on you all saying what or that kind of thing.
Right.
I think one of the things every time I learn this stuff, I relearn it, I see new things, and I can remember well the first time I learned it and being pretty much at sea. The prevalence has such a big impact on predictive value positive, but specificity has an impact as well. It's just a much less of a significant impact. Mm-hmm. Is that right?
Yep.
All right.
So before I move on to the next 2 or 3 slides, let me just stop and see if anyone has any questions or comments about predictive value positive and negative.
Hey, Gib, this is Craig. I'll just say that I was glad to work with this. That was one of the comments that I had in one of the from one of the previous case studies that I'd like to see or like to have more practice with predictive value. So I appreciate it. I thought it was good.
Thank you, Craig. Yes, it is. It's actually an extremely important parameter for a screening program to know, to know what the prevalence of the disease or an approximate value of that in a given population, because that can really impact whether you are in fact identifying a lot of false positives, and which was the case with for example, the blood donors in the HFA screening study, where there were the predictive value of the test was extremely low. And so the vast majority of people who had a positive test did not actually have HIV infection. And so that creates dilemmas for everybody in terms of, should people be notified of these results, which are unlikely to be wrong?
Also, one of the things that people do to work with this is screening is one of those things that get named a lot these days. In my section, I put up a thing from a newspaper which just set my teeth on edge, which had to do with screening women for low testosterone, which is just, who knows what the normal values are, and on and on and on. But one of the ways that we have of working with this is to target high-risk populations, like the people in the drug abuse clinic, where you then decide there are people where groups that may have a higher prevalence, and you target screening towards them, recognizing that in fact you might have a diluted population, you might not be able to target those people as well, but that you don't want to do it universally with a low prevalence.
Yeah, good point. Yeah, so as Sharon just said, screening programs often will try to target high-risk populations in order to have better screening parameters for the screening program. Good. Any other comments or questions?
I guess folks, I had put up a little thing about the optical density in the lab tests. That was one that it seemed like people wanted to go over. Would people like to talk about that more, or is that okay?
Sharon, could you repeat that, please?
Sure. In the case study, I think it might have been part 2. It had the laboratory test with the 2 distributions. It might have been part 3. Do you remember?
It was in part two?
Part two.
First question.
And it had to do with, as you change the cutoff, what happened to the sensitivity and specificity? Wow, look at you, you got it right there.
Yeah, this is from a different class with a different question number, and so ignore the stuff on the left. In fact, I will get rid of the stuff on the left.
But people seem to find it both interesting and confusing. And I think that this is one of those epiphanal moments for me in working with public health, especially coming from clinical medicine. I had always thought that laboratory tests were, I don't know, like figured out that there were actually normals that were normal, and I did not realize where some of these laboratory values came from. And the whole notion that, in fact, you're going to have a population of people that would be established as normal and a population of people that would be established as disease, and those two curves or distributions would probably overlap. In the perfect world, they would be completely separate from each other so that nobody normal would ever be screened in, because the cutoff would be above anybody that's normal, and nobody would have a normal value if they were diseased. But most laboratory tests look like this bimodal distribution with overlap. And so one has to decide, do I want it at cutoff A, B, or C? And depending on the disease, depending on the criteria that WHO were described in, I think, also part 3 or part 4, I'm losing my parts now, then one would shift the cutoff depending on the sort of various forces at play. And the question asks, what happens if you shift the cutoff?
Right. It turns out this is a figure that's slightly different than the one in the case study, but it illustrates the same points. And there are 3 different cutoffs that are shown here.
Yeah, in the case study, it used optical density, but this could be spirometry for asthma. It could be a blood test for iron. It could be, it could even be a pregnancy test. It could be any kind of test that you have in which you're trying to discriminate between normal and abnormal.
Yep. Okay.
Good. All right. Anybody, any questions with that? Who determines where the cutoff is? Oh, good one. I'm going to give the pathologist start on that one.
Well, usually, Catherine, there are people who basically develop various kinds of laboratory tests, both diagnostic tests as well as screening tests. And usually they run these tests on a bunch of different people and determine the sensitivity and the specificity of the test, because those are inherent to the test itself and not dependent upon the prevalence of disease in a population or the group of test subjects.
And they would do those tests on people who are very abnormal or they would try these out with.
Well, yeah, it would depend on the setting. In the case of a diagnostic test, you might end up doing it more with people who have diseases or people who are, say, hospitalized. Mm-hmm. But for a screening test, you might well deal with a different population, because that's going to be as a test that's going to be designed to be run in a much lower prevalence of disease situation than you might find if you've got hospitalized patients, for example.
So if I understand right, the first people that would do it, the people developing the test would be the first folks to sort of step up and say what the sensitivity and specificity were.
Right. And they would usually try to optimize the sensitivity and the specificity so that, in fact, they were both as high as possible. Again, depending on what you're looking for, what the disease is that you're screening for. And this was borne out in some of the discussion, some of the questions in the case study. There may be a desire to try to make the test as sensitive as possible, trying to find all potential cases, even if it results in increased numbers of false positives. And so that may be, and a lower specificity, that may be a trade-off that people are willing to do in order to find all of them. In other cases, it may be a different situation where you're sort of just optimizing it between the two. For example, the point B in this particular diagram here would probably provide the best balance between sensitivity and specificity. Whereas if you had this cutoff at A in this particular diagram, that would have the greatest sensitivity but lower specificity. Whereas if you had it at C, you would have lower sensitivity because a number of people with disease would not be picked up, but you would have greater specificity. So anyway, so it's people who develop the tests often will determine where these cutoffs should be. Sometimes if the test, and once you go out and use these for screening, you start to run into problems that you had not anticipated when you determine these cutoffs. They can be adjusted if necessary.
So the researchers might do the first round and say what it is. Do they get clearance like FDA, or do they have to prove that it actually predicts anything? Or
well, most of these laboratory tests, in fact, do have to be approved by, there's a thing called the Clinical Lab Improvement Act.
Oh, CLIA.
CLIA, which in fact concerns these kinds of laboratory tests, and including screening tests. And the manufacturers of the products that are used for screening or for diagnostic tests have to get approval of the tests to be used in different settings.
And so in that situation, they might show how well they actually reflect the serum value, but it's up to the epidemiologist to show how well the serum value actually reflects the outcome or the disease outcome.
Yeah, they're probably,
Okay.
that's right. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Now, sometimes will they like use NHANES or much larger data sets at some point?
I do not know the answer to that. I don't know if any of the folks developing the diagnostic tests have done so in conjunction with some of the national surveys.
Mhm.
I don't know.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
And Catherine says, is there an ethical aspect that comes into play when determining the cutoff?
Well,
And I think there's a hint of ethics to the whole notion of, are you going to be wanting more to catch more people? Or are you worried about throwing away a lot of units of blood? Or, I mean, there's ethics that sort of haunt either end of this decision making.
Yep, I think that's true. Again, it depends a bit on the condition that you're looking at, the populations that are being screened, and the implications of positive tests as well as negative tests. And if the positive screening test carries with it, if further testing that might be done to confirm a positive screening test is essentially without any adverse effects at all, then it might be easier to put a test at using a high sensitivity. But typically, people don't like to find out that they may have some condition. So that's a aspect of the test cutoffs that comes into play too, even if there are not any bad diagnostic tests, for example, like biopsies or other kinds of surgical procedures that are sometimes used to make a diagnosis in somebody who has screened positively.
And it's different in Canada than in the US. For example, in the United States, if you were screened positive for a condition, you could then lose your health insurance. And perhaps those days will be changing now. But for certain chronic diseases, it was a very big deal. If you got screened positive, then your pre-existing condition would be present, and that could be a problem for you. So lack of universal coverage added an ethical element to that as well. Great questions. Thank you.
All right. Let's actually go to something else now, which is another set of questions that a couple of people asked about in terms of screening. And I'm going to go over actually 3 slides here that are going to deal with something known as lead time, and then a couple of kinds of bias that can be introduced by screening programs. Let me briefly explain this particular slide. I hope that people can see this relatively well. The very bottom section of the slide, which has a line going to the right, is intended to represent sort of a timeline for a disease. And on the very left-hand side, we see the word exposure. So there's presumably some sort of exposure or something that happens that is important in the cause of the disease. And then at some subsequent point, there is what we're calling the biologic onset of disease, where there actually are pathologic changes that take place within the body that mark onset of disease, which is at this point not even detectable by any known test, for example. After the passage of some time, with many conditions, many diseases, there it reaches a point where the disease might be detectable with specialized tests, screening tests in particular. And then more time passes, and then usually a disease might have symptoms that appear that can be seen without any tests at all. For example, maybe a person starts to develop a mass within their body, or they start having bleeding in their stools, or anyway, a number of other things could start to occur, or they might start developing a fever with an infection. Then after some more time, the disease is presumably diagnosed if the person seeks some sort of health care. There may be therapy available, and that's given, and then the clinical outcome may depend on what the disease is and the effectiveness of given therapies. So this is just intended to show a timeline. There is a period which is labeled as DPCP, which is from the disease being detectable to symptoms first appearing, which is known as the detectable preclinical phase. And this is a period of time during which, with specialized tests, you can actually detect the disease in a given person. The line at the top simply shows what we usually think of as primary, secondary, and tertiary prevention and how they relate to the timeline down at the bottom.
And is the preclinical phase sort of the same as the subclinical stage that we might have learned in infectious disease epi? Okay,
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
So then the next slide shows what can happen with a screening program or a screening test. So that if a screening test is available, then that detects the disease, and then usually there is some sort of a follow-up or additional tests that are run on a person to actually make the diagnosis of a given condition. And what has happened is that the point of diagnosis for the disease in a given person has shifted to the left on this timeline. In other words, to an earlier time. And that, the amount of that shift is what is known as the lead time. This is diagnosis now occurring earlier, purely as a result of screening of a population, of a person within a population. Is that, I just want to stop for a second. Is that clear to folks? Anyone have any questions about what this is? Because we're going to now use this information to illustrate the effect of lead time on survival times.
So at the population level, you might have a bunch of people, you've been doing some kind of follow-up of people. And now if you're doing earlier screening or you have a better test, you're going to be diagnosing people earlier. So they're going to look like they survive longer?
Yeah, we will look at that in
Okay.
just a second.
All right.
That's correct.
Sounds like it's clear.
And I guess that's clear. All right. So the next thing that we're going to look at is some specific examples of different people and what happens with screening and survival times. So first of all, there's a timeline at the top of this slide showing different ages from 40 up to 80. And then we have 4 different cases, case 1, 2, 3, and 4, or we could call them different patients, but different situations. These are meant to be individual people. And I have here letters A, B, C, D, E, F, and G, which represent different points along the curve, along the timeline, excuse me, that we looked at during the last slide. So for example, A represents the biologic onset of disease. B is when the disease becomes detectable. C would be when screening might detect the disease. D is when symptoms first appear. E is when the disease is diagnosed. F is when therapy is given, and G is death. So, for example, in the very top slide, we have someone, there's no screening undertaken with this person. The disease is actually detectable at point B, but there is no detection until the point D, which is when the disease is detected. And sorry, when symptoms first appear, and then at E, the disease is diagnosed. And then from E until G, this is what's known as the person's survival time. Let's say the person has developed lung cancer and it is diagnosed at point E and they survive roughly, in this particular slide, it shows survival of about 7 or 8 years once the diagnosis has been made. Now, in case 2, let's say that there's a screening program, and in fact, at point C, the person is screened, and in fact, the screening test is positive and suggests the person has disease, and they get some further follow-up tests, and then at point E, the disease is actually diagnosed. So, remembering what we talked about during the last slide, the point of diagnosis has now been shifted to the left by roughly 10 years in this situation. This is known as the lead time. And because survival time is typically measured from the point of disease diagnosis to death, it will appear that in this particular person's case, that their survival time after diagnosis of disease is now 10 years longer than it was. So there will be a significantly increased survival time for this person from the disease. And if you had this in a whole population of people that were screened, it would appear that in fact the screening program brought about, in fact, a marked increase in survival time for the population. In fact, what we see here is that there is no increase, there is no increase in the actual survival beyond the time they would have normally died at G. There is simply an apparent increase in the survival time because of the screening program and what we know as the lead time. And so this actually creates what we call lead time bias, which is a thing that can happen with screening programs.
One of the things, Ashley just asked if in case 1, would the time between B and D be considered the latent period? And that, yes.
Fair enough, yes. That's what it would be called. I mean, in some cases, you might actually call the latent period all the way from A, when, for example, infection or the first biologic onset occurs, out to D. But that's usually what you'd call a latent period. For example, if you got infected with a certain, like with HIV at point A, that would be the latent period from there until the onset of symptoms from the infection itself.
And that could even include the incubation period. There's a lot of language here that gets used depending on what we're talking about.
Yeah.
One of the things I wanted to mention, just as a reminder, is this timeline. There are some assumptions made in screening and some of this stuff that are not necessarily true and are not being assumed here. But for example, and this is particularly true with cancer, not every case of cancer is going to go on to metastasis and death. Not every disease is going to go on to its worst scenario. In fact, most times people get better and the disease, whatever it is, remits. And one of the problems that we have in the way we think about some of these things is that depending on the situation, anywhere from 2/3 or something to 1/3 or some number are going to remit. And the immune system will clean it up, that kind of thing. And so one of the problems we have in considering even things like breast cancer is that some proportion of them would get better on their own. But if we are assuming that all disease inexorably moves to metastasis and death, then we treat everything the minute we find it, and we don't tell the difference between what would get better on its own and what doesn't. So some of these things, if you actually drew them out, you'd have some percent at different periods of time relapsing to zero. I mean, to healthy.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, sorry. Yeah.
It's okay.
Yeah.
So now let's move down to case 3. And case 3 is very similar to case 2. The person has been screened. Disease was detected during this preclinical phase, and therapy was instituted at the same time as in case 2. But in this particular case, it turns out therapy is in fact more effective. There's a more effective therapy if it's given earlier here. And so the person's survival has been increased by about 5 years. In other words, G has been shifted to the right. So this person, case 3, shows an even greater increase in survival time compared to case 2. And in this case, it is a combination both of the lead time that results from screening and early detection, as well as an increase in survival from a more effective therapy once it's if it's implemented earlier in the course of disease. So again, there still is a lead time bias here. It increases the survival time, but in fact, there is in fact a true increase in survival here resulting from the screening and therapy. So that is essentially, with case 1, 2, and 3 here, we've talked about the concept of lead time bias, which is again something that several people asked about in the course of their questions during the screening case study. There is one other thing which is depicted in case 4, which I will briefly go over. This is a situation in which there are some, just like Sharon said, that there's some people in whom disease develops. For example, a cancer might develop, but then on its own accord, the body basically clears it, it remits. So they would never have gone on to develop progressive disease, metastatic disease, and death from the cancer. In contrast, there are some cases of disease which are more aggressive. They follow a more aggressive course than the typical case. And certainly there are kinds of breast cancer as well as prostate cancer as well as lung cancer which do this. And in these particular situations, the whole time period may be compressed, which is shown in case 4. The thing that happens here is that because of this compression, the disease, the time between when disease can be detected and when symptoms first appear, in other words, this detectable preclinical phase, becomes very much shorter because everything's occurring more quickly. And so screening programs are less likely to, in fact, identify people like this who have more aggressive disease. And as a result, this is another way in which screening program will appear to be more effective because, in fact, people with more aggressive disease are not typically picked up as readily by the screening programs. So that is, in fact, known as linked bias sampling. Explained here briefly. Most textbooks of epidemiology will explain this further if there are more questions about this. So that's it. I just wanted to go over these things, which were things that were asked about during the course of the screening case study, and that's it. Sharon.
Yeah. Well, anything else? We were thinking of also maybe the thing for showing that table for the upcoming smoking and lung cancer. This is a great case coming up. I wanted to mention that we had left week 8 to be determined, and week 7 discussion board was going to ask about week 8, but in fact we got the information from folks and tried some things, and so fairly soon there will be a description of week 8 that goes up. There will be a choice where you can either join in on the synchronous case study on Saturday the 28th, or you can do a discussion board, or you can certainly do both. Week 7's discussion board then will be shifting from what to do in week 8 to a look at some of the articles about smoking, and to talk a little bit about vaping and e-cigarettes and some of the issues, both ethical as well as scientific, related to that. But that will go up soon on Blackboard. And this particular table, it comes from the case study, and I just wasn't sure how familiar people were with the concept of person years at risk and 1,000 person years and things like that. It may be something that you covered and feel comfortable with, but we thought just in case we might kind of show the table and just sort of orient people to it. You want to go ahead?
Sure. So this is in fact data that was taken from the study that you'll be looking at in the lung cancer case study. And
this is in Catholic, I guess, a real set. There are 2 different studies they go over, both by Dahl and Hill, who were, I think, wasn't one of them knighted because of his work?
Yes.
Sir Richard Dahl?
Richard Dahl.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Now these studies, in fact, end up going on for some time. But so I think that the original papers, we can also connect you to those too. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. So this just simply shows some data that they compiled in their study, which consists of a bunch of different information. On the left-hand side, we see daily number of cigarettes smoked, and they categorized study subjects into those who did not smoke at all, which would be 0, those smoking 1 to 14 a day, 15 to 24, and 25 plus, and then the all smokers just pools all of the folks that smoked into a single group. The number of deaths from lung cancer is in the next column, which you see there. The number of person years at risk is, this was a study that extended over a period of time. And in a study like this, which is a cohort study, there are people who you typically want to count in your denominator for the cohort study only people who are at risk for disease and for being detected as developing disease. And so, for example, if a person, let's say it's a 10-year study, and there's a person who's in the study and then after 1 year they die, well, it's not really fair to count them as contributing 10 years worth of being at risk to the study. So they would only be counting as having 1 person year for the purpose of calculating the rate. In contrast, if you had another person who entered the study and was there the whole full 10 years, they would in fact contribute 10 person years at risk for developing the disease. So what this column is, person years at risk, simply represents for all the people that were in the study, figuring out how many years at risk each one had, and then adding that up for all of the subjects. And that's what gives these numbers. And these person years at risk essentially forms the denominator for the calculation of the next column, which is mortality rate per 1,000 person years. And the top row of this table, in fact, shows us the calculation where we have 3 deaths from lung cancer divided by 42,800 person years at risk. And then that's multiplied by 1,000 because the rate's given in per 1,000 person years. So we in fact have a mortality rate of 0.07.
And in this case, because of the, in this case, because of the previous studies, the decision that, okay, smoking is associated with lung cancer in their hypothesis, then they're considering that people who don't smoke might be the referent group. They might be considered the baseline, beyond which they're then going to look at this in this stratified analysis. Groups of people that are smoking increasing amounts.
Yeah. So another way to think of this is that in people not exposed to smoking at all, there is a background rate of lung cancer and death from lung cancer, which is 0.07 deaths per 1,000 person years.
You might call that the endemic rate of lung cancer.
Then with smoking, we're going to expect that that rate is increased, but in order to calculate a rate ratio, we need to have the, quote, unexposed, which is the 0.07, that will be used for the calculation of the remainder of the rate ratios and the rate differences that you will calculate when you complete this table as part of the case study. So there you have it. You'll notice the very last line for total, that's everybody pooled, so the rate ratio and the rate difference don't make any sense because there's the reference, all the people with 0 are in there too. So that is a brief explanation of this particular table, the notion of person years at risk, and a short description of the calculation of a mortality rate using person years as the denominator. Are there any questions about that?
And so John says, we will be calculating the actual person years at risk as well. Oh, will we be calculating the actual person years at risk as well? I don't know if they're calculating.
No, in this particular case study, John, you will not. I mean, there are some case studies in which that is done as a part of the, the process. But in this particular case study, you are provided with the data already as it's put together, and you will not actually have to go through the process of calculating the person years at risk.
One of the places that a similar calculations uses in car fatalities, crash fatalities, where you're looking at clearly the more time you spend driving in a car, the more risk. So it might be per miles driven or per 100,000 miles driven, that kind of thing. Similar sort of calculation.
I don't know if any of you remember it, but when you did you looked up the data for Clark County and Salt Lake County, you were actually asked to look at FARS data, Fatal Accident Reporting System data, in order to provide the number of deaths per 100 million miles traveled for each of those counties as well as the states in the US. And so the million miles traveled there is, again, a different kind of denominator, which tries to get at a better measure of risk than just being a person who's alive. So that's what Sharon, I think, was alluding to just then. We have about 10 minutes left today. I think these are the things we wanted to present, knowing, we tried to put some material together to present to you, knowing there might not be a lot of questions, but please let us know if you have any questions or whatever. And Sharon, if you have any other things you want to say about stuff coming up.
Hello, this is Eunice.
Hi, Eunice.
Hey, with the section 3 of the case study, the screening, I got really confused about splitting the true positives. What can you explain a little bit about that?
Is that the part where they have us taking the people who were positive in the previous sections? And so,
yes.
Yeah, so what's happening is that as in a real population, the people going for the next step are only going to be the people who were positive in the previous step. And that's kind of a funny bit there. And often that's a place where it would be really lovely to have feedback a bit earlier, because only the people, I think it's 20,000. 372 people who will move on to the next step. And then the place where we got people that we didn't expect, but always a new place, is the whole notion of an aliquot, which in our experience, you take the aliquot, okay. You take the specimens that you get from each person and you pour one specimen from one person into two different bottles, so that now you have two specimens of exactly the same blood for each person, and you send one group off to one lab and one group off to another lab. And that way you can find out how your lab standards are doing and make sure. You might try, in this case, as there was, with two different tests, or you might say, I want to try these two different labs and see how they compare, to see if one's running high or if there's variation that concerns us. And so then in this case, it was, you had the higher prevalence because it was an enriched sample of people that had all tested positive on the previous test. And I think the prevalence was 1.9%. And there were two ways to start filling out that table. One was that you took the numbers from the previous table and filled in the true positives. Is that right? The
column totals.
Column totals. The other way was to use the prevalence of 1.9% and recalculate it using the 20,000 people. And so those are kind of the major things I think of. Am I covering what got you confused?
Yes, yes. And also, I think the clarification, thank you for the clarification, because I wasn't sure if you were splitting the population or
yes.
the samples that were being.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, and many people, the people who split it still got the points. So we hopefully gave everybody credit if they did it that way, because clearly if you're still be able to do by the 2x2 table, do the predictive value positive and all that, we weren't going to quibble with that. The definition of aliquot was not one of the learning objectives.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Let's see, Ashley has a note here.
Oh, the synchronous session, how long should we plan on? We were thinking that we would allow at least 2.5 to 3 hours. That's how long some of these case studies do. when they're live, but they take a while because you're having everybody read and go through it together. And it would start at, yeah, we're thinking 9:30 Eastern Standard Time, if that's okay. All right, good. And if we can, maybe in the next, we'll put an announcement out in the 3 sections so that we can have a sense of how many folks will be there. I don't think we'll have any problems managing, and we might try to do some things by video, that kind of thing. The discussion board that day, so if you can't, could you do 1 hour earlier? 1 hour later, sorry, 1 hour later. We could do 1 hour later. How does that work for other people?
Starting at 10:30.
Starting at 10:30 instead. It is early for the West Coasters or the other time zones. Daughter's birthday. Well, what I would say is that we can split the difference as well. I'm not sure okay, good. Is that if you join in late, it's okay. You can catch up. And can we just say 10 then?
Sure.
Split the difference. If you come in late or have to leave early, it's not a crime. And that way, we can also, we may send it beforehand. No, we wouldn't. No,
Probably not.
Probably not. Okay. We're conferring with each other. And if you have to leave early, that is not a problem. What we tend to do is we go around working as a group to read and talk about the questions. So if you have to fall out, it's okay. And the discussion board question, if for some reason you couldn't do most of the session, the discussion board question is going to be where we're all bringing to each other tools of epidemiology tools and things like data sets, display, things like that, that it hopefully will bring examples of different, I guess I call it tools, that we'll share with each other. Anyway, that's what comes to mind.
Mm-hmm. Does anyone have a request for any particular kind of condition, disease, or whatever that we would cover in this synchronous case study?
We have choices like surveillance, outbreaks, infectious disease.
Something deadly. Oh, okay.
Something that gets your attention, huh?
All right. Well,
a little drama, huh?
We'll see what we can find. And outbreaks.
Okay.
All right. Well, the outbreaks are no problem because there are
plenty of them.
Plenty of those. We don't have a whole lot of outbreaks that are quite as deadly as, for example, the botulism outbreak, because botulism is a pretty serious disease. Most of the outbreaks are waterborne outbreaks, water or foodborne outbreaks that result in various kinds of gastroenteritis.
Although with immune-compromised people, they
can be more serious. Yes.
I think there are a couple we have to look at that have other things, but yeah. Okay, good.
All right.
Good.
Well, it's coming up on 9 o'clock. This is the last call for questions or comments or whatever.
Yep. And feel free to email. Thank you for coming.
Right.
It was great showing. And we will put the recording up. It's great to see you.
Thanks a lot. Have a good week.